She was 58 years old when the sea became the only thing in the world that still welcomed her. The Council of Grey Haven had taken away the cottage where she had lived for nearly 3 decades after claiming she could no longer pay the taxes left behind by her late brother, and the townsfolk whispered that grief had clouded her judgment because, with only $23 folded carefully inside a weathered leather purse, she walked into a forgotten county auction and bought an abandoned lighthouse standing alone on a lonely stretch of the Maine coast. They laughed that no sensible woman would spend the last coins she possessed on cracked stone, broken lantern glass, and a tower everyone believed should have been left to the gulls and the wind. They called it a monument to failure before she had even stepped through its heavy oak door. Yet none of them knew that somewhere behind the worn spiral staircase, sealed away by hands that had vanished into history many years before, rested a hidden chamber carrying a secret powerful enough to restore not only her own life, but the soul of an entire fishing community that had nearly forgotten what honor truly meant. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Martha Ellison. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten by the world, tell us where you're listening from in the comments, because forgotten places often remember the greatest stories. Long before the storms carved white scars across the cliffs below Grey Haven, before salt gathered inside the wrinkles of her hands and silver replaced the chestnut color of her hair, Martha Ellison had been the sort of child who believed every object carried a memory, waiting patiently for someone willing to listen. While other children chased one another across fields bright with summer flowers, she wandered beside old docks collecting rusted hooks, worn pieces of rope, broken compass cases, and smooth driftwood shaped by tides that had traveled farther than any traveler she would ever meet. She rarely returned home with empty hands, not because the things she gathered held any obvious value, but because her father taught her that usefulness was often hidden beneath years of neglect. Elias Ellison had spent most of his life repairing boats that richer men considered beyond saving. He never hurried through his work. Every plank received the same careful attention, whether it belonged to the largest merchant vessel or a tiny fishing skiff owned by a widow struggling to feed her children. He often told Martha that timber remembered kindness just as surely as people did, and if someone took the time to understand how a thing had broken, they could usually discover how it wished to become whole again. She did not fully understand those words while she was young, but she remembered them. Their little workshop stood close enough to the shoreline that the tide seemed to breathe beneath its floorboards. The smell of pine shavings mixed with salt water drifted through every season, and sunlight entered through dusty windows that painted bright ribbons across workbenches crowded with tools older than either of them. Martha learned to sharpen chisels before she learned elegant handwriting. She could identify different woods simply by touching them with closed eyes. She knew where a beam carried hidden weakness long before anyone else noticed the crack beginning to spread. Her mother, Eleanor, possessed quieter gifts. She read aloud every evening beside the fire while wind pressed gently against the cottage walls. She favored journals written by explorers, sea captains, lighthouse keepers, and ordinary women whose names history had forgotten. Each story reminded Martha that greatness seldom announced itself loudly. Sometimes it lived inside people who never expected recognition. When Martha reached 16, fishermen throughout Grey Haven had already begun greeting her with the same respect they showed her father. If a damaged mast arrived at the workshop while Elias delivered another vessel, Martha accepted the task without complaint. She measured twice, cut once, and refused shortcuts. Men who initially doubted her because she was young quietly changed their opinions after watching boats she repaired survive winters that destroyed newer vessels built elsewhere. Her father never celebrated these victories with grand speeches. Instead, he simply smiled while handing her another difficult task. "Confidence grows best," he once said, when no bells from the small church echoed across calm mornings. Fishing boats departed before dawn, their lanterns floating across dark water like patient stars. Children carried baskets between neighboring cottages without locking doors because everyone believed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. The lighthouse, standing on Black Gull Point, watched silently over everything, its great lantern turning faithfully each night beneath the careful eye of keeper Thomas Mercer. Thomas had no children of his own. Perhaps that explained why he welcomed curious youngsters who climbed the steep path simply to hear stories about distant ships. Martha often joined them, though unlike the others, she paid closer attention to the lighthouse itself than the tales it inspired. She admired the spiral staircase winding upward through stone walls nearly 3 feet thick. She noticed tiny repairs hidden beneath fresh paint. She wondered who had carved initials into beams invisible from ordinary view. Thomas laughed kindly whenever he found her studying the building instead of the sea. "You've got the eyes of someone who notices what everyone else walks past." She considered that the finest compliment anyone had ever offered. Years passed. Storms came and went. Boats were built. Others were buried beneath the waves. Life carried both joy and sorrow with equal certainty. Then illness arrived quietly inside their little cottage. Elias never complained about aching hands or growing weakness. He simply worked a little slower each week until even lifting ordinary boards exhausted him. Martha took over more responsibilities without being asked. Customers continued arriving because they trusted the Ellison name, though they gradually realized the daughter had become the true craftswoman behind it. The day Elias finally admitted he could no longer work, he asked Martha to walk with him to the shoreline. The evening sky glowed gold across calm water while gulls circled lazily overhead. He handed her his favorite measuring rule, its edges worn smooth by decades of careful use. "There will come a day," he said softly, "when people insist something cannot be saved." She listened without speaking. "They'll ask you to throw it away because replacing it seems easier." A gentle breeze carried the scent of the sea around them. "When that day comes, don't let their certainty become your own." Those became the final words of advice he ever gave her. He passed away before winter surrendered to spring. The workshop grew quieter afterward, but Martha refused to close its doors. Every repair she completed honored the lessons woven into her childhood. Every vessel returned safely to the harbor reminded her that patient hands could outlast despair. Her mother survived another 7 years. During those evenings, Eleanor continued reading beside the fire, though her voice weakened with passing seasons. Before illness finally carried her away, she entrusted Martha with a weathered wooden chest containing journals collected throughout her lifetime. "Read people who paid attention," Eleanor whispered. "Most of the world is too busy looking ahead to notice what's already speaking." After that, silence became Martha's closest companion. She never married, not because love failed to find her, but because responsibility asked more of her than comfort ever could. Her younger brother Samuel worked aboard merchant vessels sailing between Maine and Massachusetts, returning home only a few times each year. Whenever he came back, Martha prepared his favorite meals, repaired whatever clothing he had worn thin, and listened patiently while he described bustling ports and distant coastlines she would probably never see. Samuel admired her steady nature, though he sometimes teased that she understood old wood better than living people. She laughed because there was enough truth inside the joke to make it gentle. As decades passed, many familiar faces disappeared from Gray Haven. Wealthier fishing companies arrived with larger boats. Small family businesses struggled beneath changing markets. Young people departed for growing cities where factories promised dependable wages. Yet Martha remained. She repaired docks no one else wished to mend. She volunteered whenever storms damaged cottages belonging to elderly neighbors. She quietly replaced broken porch steps overnight if she noticed someone struggling to climb them. Many beneficiaries never discovered who had performed the work. She preferred it that way. Recognition had never interested her, only usefulness. Meanwhile, the lighthouse continued standing proudly above Black Gull Point, though age slowly claimed it as well. New shipping routes reduced its importance. Government funding shrank. Repairs were delayed year after year until windows cracked, paint peeled away, and whispers spread that maintaining such an isolated structure no longer justified the expense. Old keeper Thomas Mercer retired. Another keeper replaced him briefly. Then automation arrived. Eventually, the great tower fell dark. Nobody celebrated its silence. Nobody mourned it very loudly either. The sea simply continued rising and falling beneath empty windows while gulls nested where lantern light had once guided strangers safely home. Whenever Martha walked along the cliffs, she found herself glancing toward that lonely tower. Not because she imagined owning it, not because she dreamed of restoring it, but because abandoned places always seemed to wait with extraordinary patience. They never demanded attention. They simply hoped someone might someday remember they still existed. She often wondered whether buildings felt loneliness the same way forgotten people did. It was an unusual thought. Then again, Martha Ellison had always noticed things other people overlooked. She could not have known that every lesson her parents had quietly planted across those peaceful decades, the careful hands of her father, the thoughtful heart of her mother, the habit of looking beyond appearances, the willingness to repair instead of discard, had been preparing her for a single impossible decision that would ask everything she had left to give. Nor could she imagine that somewhere within the silent stone walls of the abandoned lighthouse, another family many years before had trusted the future to a secret no one had successfully uncovered. The sea remembered. The lighthouse remembered. History itself was waiting with remarkable patience. Only Martha had yet to arrive. The seasons have a quiet way of convincing us that tomorrow will resemble yesterday, especially in small towns where familiar faces pass the same storefronts year after year, and church bells measure time more faithfully than clocks. Grey Haven had lived that way for generations, believing the sea would always provide enough fish, that neighbors would always recognize one another, and that the traditions built by grandparents could never disappear. But change seldom arrives with a trumpet. It comes one unnoticed decision at a time. When the first large commercial fishing company established its operations several miles down the coast, many welcomed it with hopeful smiles. Bigger boats meant more jobs, larger markets, and promises carried by polished men wearing expensive coats who spoke confidently about progress. They shook hands in the town hall, unfolded crisp maps across wooden tables, and assured everyone that Grey Haven would become more prosperous than it had ever been. Some believed them immediately. Others hesitated. Martha simply listened. She had spent too many years repairing broken things not to recognize the sound of promises built upon fragile timber. The new company brought iron-hulled vessels capable of staying at sea for weeks instead of days. Independent fishermen found themselves accepting lower prices for every catch. Families who had owned their own boats for generations slowly accumulated debts they never expected to owe. The changes happened gradually enough that few people noticed until there was no easy path back. Old workshops closed. Net makers found fewer customers. The cooper who built fish barrels retired without an apprentice willing to continue the trade. Each loss seemed small by itself. Together, they quietly changed the soul of the town. Martha continued repairing boats, though there were fewer owners able to afford proper maintenance. She often accepted payment in vegetables, smoked fish, or simply a promise that someone would help another neighbor when the opportunity came. Wealth had never mattered greatly to her. Keeping people afloat did. There were evenings when she locked the workshop after sunset and discovered only a handful of coins resting inside the cash drawer. She counted them carefully anyway, not because the amount pleased her, because every honest coin represented trust someone had placed in her hands. Samuel noticed the struggle whenever he returned from sea. His own life had become increasingly uncertain aboard merchant ships competing against steam-powered vessels that crossed the Atlantic faster each year. His letters arrived less frequently now, though every page carried the same steady affection he had always shown his older sister. "You work too hard," one letter read. "You worry too much," another answered months later. She smiled while reading them beside the fire. Neither of them had ever learned how to follow their own advice. Then, during one bitter January, Samuel returned unexpectedly. He looked older than the calendar suggested. The cheerful confidence that usually accompanied him had been replaced by quiet hesitation. Over supper, he admitted the shipping company intended to retire several older sailing vessels, including the one where he served as quartermaster. "They say steam is the future," he said while turning his spoon thoughtfully inside the bowl. "Perhaps they're right." Martha reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "The future has room for honest people." He nodded politely, but she could see uncertainty settling deeper behind his eyes. Unable to remain idle, Samuel invested what little savings he possessed into a partnership proposed by two businessmen from Portland. They claimed to have discovered an opportunity transporting preserved seafood inland by rail. They spoke with confidence, displayed impressive documents bearing official-looking seals, and promised handsome returns within 2 years. Martha disliked the arrangement immediately, not because she distrusted ambition, because neither man ever looked directly at the people whose money they requested. Her father had once said that trustworthy craftsmen looked first at the work. Dishonest men looked first at your purse. She shared her concerns gently. Samuel listened, then sighed. I've spent my whole life working for someone else's ship. I know. I wanted to build something of my own. She understood that longing. More importantly, she understood why he ignored the uneasy feeling that lingered inside him. Hope has persuaded wiser people than Samuel to believe impossible promises. Within 18 months, the partnership collapsed. The businessmen vanished. The accounts proved nearly worthless. Samuel returned carrying not success, but debt. Large debt. Debt far beyond anything either sibling could comfortably repay. They spent many evenings sitting together beneath lamplight reviewing papers spread across the kitchen table. Martha sold tools she rarely used. Samuel accepted whatever labor he could find unloading cargo or repairing docks. Every extra dollar disappeared toward interest that seemed to grow faster than they could reduce it. Still, neither complained. Their parents had raised them differently. When hardship knocked, the Ellisons answered with work, not bitterness. Then came the autumn storm. People in Gray Haven remembered it simply as the long gale. For 3 relentless days the Atlantic battered the coast with towering waves that smashed docks, flooded warehouses, and shattered dozens of fishing vessels against hidden rocks. Even houses standing well above the shoreline suffered broken roofs and shattered windows. Martha spent nearly every waking hour helping rescue damaged boats before tides carried them away forever. She climbed slippery pilings despite aching knees. She hauled soaked lumber beside men half her age. She repaired temporary shelters for families whose cottages no longer kept out rain. By the time calm weather finally returned, she could barely lift her own hands. The workshop survived. Barely. Its roof required expensive repairs. Half the stored lumber had been ruined by seawater. Several customers who owed payment admitted they would never be able to settle their accounts. Martha forgave every debt without hesitation. "You've already paid," she told one elderly fisherman. He looked confused. With 40 years of friendship, he cried before leaving. Gray Haven slowly recovered, or at least it appeared to. The visible damage disappeared long before invisible struggles healed. Samuel's health began failing not long afterward. Years aboard cold decks and endless storms had quietly weakened his lungs. What began as an ordinary cough lingered through winter, then spring, then another summer. Doctors from Bangor offered expensive medicines that provided little lasting relief. Martha sold nearly everything that still carried value. Her mother's silver serving spoon, her father's spare tool chest, the old rocking chair where Eleanor had once read stories every evening. One by one they disappeared into other homes. Samuel apologized each time. She always answered the same way. They're only things. But secretly she missed each one. Not because of its worth. Because memories never separate cleanly from the objects that carried them. Near the end, Samuel spent long afternoons watching the sea through the workshop window. "I should have listened. You were trying to build a future. I nearly destroyed yours." She smiled gently. "You gave me family." He lowered his eyes. "I left you dead." She reached for his weathered hand. "No." He looked up. "You left me someone worth helping." Those words became the last conversation they shared. Samuel passed quietly before sunrise while rain tapped softly against the cottage roof. The funeral drew nearly everyone in town. Former shipmates carried his simple pine coffin. Fishermen removed their caps. Even children who barely remembered him stood respectfully beside their parents. For one afternoon, Gray Haven became the close-knit community it had once been. Then ordinary life resumed, and the letters began arriving. First came polite reminders from creditors. Then firmer notices. Finally, legal documents stamped with county seals informing Martha that Samuel's remaining obligations had become claims against the estate they jointly occupied. She stared at those papers for a long time. Not because she failed to understand them, because she understood them perfectly. The cottage had never been wealthy. It had always been home. Every board inside those walls had been touched by her parents. Every room carried echoes impossible to replace. She traveled to the county office carrying receipts, savings records, and careful calculations showing what she could realistically repay over time. The clerk sympathized. The council members listened politely. One elderly commissioner even admitted everyone respected Martha deeply. Respect, however, could not erase legal obligations. Rules remained rules. Extensions became shorter. Interest continued growing. Eventually, the final hearing arrived. Martha wore her best dark blue dress, carefully mended at the sleeves. She answered every question honestly. She never begged, never accused, never raised her voice. When the decision came, the council declared the property must be sold to satisfy outstanding debts and unpaid taxes accumulated during Samuel's illness. She thanked them. Several people looked surprised. One commissioner quietly removed his spectacles. "I am sorry. I know." Outside the courthouse, autumn leaves drifted across empty streets while distant church bells announced the noon hour. Martha stood very still, not because she expected the verdict to change, because she needed one quiet moment before telling herself to keep walking. Neighbors offered kind words over the following weeks. Some brought pies. Others helped pack boxes. Many promised to visit wherever she eventually settled. Kindness surrounded her. Yet kindness could not stop the auction. On the appointed morning, strangers wandered through rooms that had once belonged entirely to memory. They discussed furniture as though it were ordinary merchandise. They tested drawers, opened cupboards, measured windows. Children laughed without realizing they were running across floors where another family had built an entire lifetime. Martha blamed none of them. How could they understand? Every house appears ordinary until it has loved someone long enough. When the final sale concluded, very little remained after debts, taxes, legal fees, and expenses had been deducted. The county treasurer counted the remaining money twice before sliding it across the desk. $23. Nothing more. Enough to rent a small room for a short while. Enough to leave Gray Haven forever if she wished. Not enough to begin again. She folded the bills carefully inside the same leather purse her father had once given her as a birthday gift nearly 40 years earlier. Then she carried one small suitcase down the front steps of the only home she had ever truly known. She did not look back immediately. She closed the gate first, straightened it out of habit, then rested her hand upon the weathered fence one final time. The cottage stood silently beneath the afternoon sun. It had sheltered 4 members of the Ellison family. Now it belonged to someone else. Martha whispered a quiet thank you to the empty house. Then she walked away with $23, one suitcase, and a lifetime of lessons no creditor had been able to take from her. She believed she had reached the lowest point of her journey. The sea, however, was already preparing to place something extraordinary in her path. For several days after leaving the cottage, Martha stayed in the narrow upstairs room of Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, a widow who rented inexpensive accommodations to travelers and laborers passing through Gray Haven. The room was clean, though modest, with a single iron bed, a washstand, and one small window overlooking the harbor. From there she watched fishing boats depart before sunrise exactly as they always had, their lanterns drifting across the dark water like floating stars. Everything outside appeared unchanged. Only her place within it had vanished. Each morning she folded her blanket neatly, swept the floor although no one required it, and helped Mrs. Holloway prepare breakfast before quietly searching for work. There were fences to mend, roofs needing patches, and cracked porch rails waiting for careful hands. She accepted every task offered, not because the wages were generous, they rarely were, but because honest labor had always been the surest companion she knew. Yet opportunities grew fewer with every passing week. Many families were struggling themselves. There were simply not enough repairs to support everyone who depended upon them. One chilly afternoon, Martha wandered farther along the waterfront than she usually did. The tide had pulled far away from the docks, exposing smooth stones glistening beneath pale autumn sunlight. The familiar smell of salt and seaweed drifted through the air while gulls argued loudly overhead. Near the old ship chandlery, she noticed a weathered notice nailed crookedly to a post. County surplus auction. Buildings. Equipment. Miscellaneous property. Saturday morning. She would ordinarily have walked past without another thought. After all, what possible use could someone with $23 have for an auction? But something made her stop. Perhaps it was habit. Perhaps curiosity. Or perhaps the strange pull she had always felt toward forgotten things. Inside the small auction office, an elderly clerk sorted yellowing papers into uneven stacks. Without looking up, he asked, "Looking to buy, or just keeping warm?" "Mostly keeping warm," Martha answered with a faint smile. That earned a chuckle. He slid a folded catalog toward her. "There isn't much worth seeing." She thanked him anyway. The booklet listed worn wagons, abandoned sheds, broken machinery, and used storage buildings, and parcels of neglected land that no longer generated enough revenue to justify maintenance. She turned the brittle pages slowly until her eyes settled upon one final entry printed almost as an afterthought. County property number 37. Black Gull Point Lighthouse. Sold as is. No warranty. No operational equipment. Buyer responsible for all repairs. Minimum opening bid, $20. Martha stared at the words longer than she intended. The clerk noticed. Nobody wants that old tower. She looked up. No. He shook his head. The lantern's gone. Roof leaks. Salt's eaten half the ironwork. Roads barely passable after rain. Costs more to fix than it'll ever be worth. He reached for the catalog again. They only included it because the county's tired of paying someone to keep trespassers away. She thanked him once more and stepped outside. The wind had strengthened. Across the harbor, she could just make out the distant silhouette of Black Gull Point. The abandoned lighthouse stood against the gray horizon exactly as it always had. Lonely, silent, patient. She should have forgotten about it immediately. Instead, she spent the entire evening thinking about it. Logic insisted it was impossible. She possessed barely enough money to feed herself. Owning a ruined lighthouse would solve nothing. It had no proper plumbing, no reliable heat, no furniture, no guarantee the roof would survive another winter. Common sense listed reason after reason why the idea bordered on foolishness. Yet another quieter voice continued speaking beneath all those practical objections. She remembered Thomas Mercer saying she noticed what others ignored. She remembered her father's belief that broken things deserved careful attention before being discarded. She remembered her mother's stories about places history had quietly abandoned. Most of all, she remembered how the lighthouse had always stood watch over Grey Haven without asking anything in return. Now everyone had abandoned it, just as they had quietly moved on from people like herself. She slept very little that night. On Saturday morning, the auction grounds buzzed with far fewer people than expected. Farmers examined old wagons. Scrap dealers inspected rusting equipment. Two brothers argued cheerfully over a stack of damaged barrels. Nobody seemed interested in the final pages of the catalog. The auctioneer worked briskly through livestock pens, tools, and storage buildings. Small crowds gathered around practical items while Martha lingered near the back, saying almost nothing. Hours passed. Finally, the clerk announced the county properties. One neglected shed sold quickly. An unused warehouse attracted modest bidding. A narrow strip of marshland changed hands after little discussion. Then came property number 37. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Black Gull Point Lighthouse. County surplus. Sold as is. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the crowd. Someone called out, "Comes with ghosts, does it?" Another answered, "Ghosts are probably the only tenants it'll ever have." More laughter. The auctioneer smiled politely. Opening bid, $20. Silence. He looked around. $20? No reply. Several people had already begun walking toward the next display. The old lighthouse seemed destined to remain unwanted. Then Martha raised her hand. "I'll offer 20. Heads turned. One man blinked in surprise before recognizing her. "Martha Ellison?" Another whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Has she lost her senses?" The auctioneer pointed toward her. $20 received. He waited. "Do I hear 21? No one answered. A younger fisherman laughed openly. "Let her have it. She'll need wings to keep that roof from blowing away." More chuckles followed. Even those who meant no cruelty found amusement in the situation. After all, everyone knew Martha had recently lost her home. What sensible person, possessing only a handful of dollars, would choose a crumbling lighthouse over a rented room somewhere safe? The auctioneer asked once more. No further bids? None came. His gavel struck the block. "Sold." The sound echoed strangely inside Martha's chest. For a moment, she wondered whether she had made the greatest mistake of her life. She counted $20 bills into the clerk's waiting hand. When the paperwork was finished, he slid 5 heavy iron keys attached to an old brass ring across the table. "I suppose these belong to you now." The keys were cold, heavier than she expected. Each had been worn smooth by decades of use. She closed her fingers around them. They felt oddly familiar, not because she had ever held them before, because they seemed to carry the weight of many forgotten hands. After taxes and filing fees, $3 remained inside her purse. $3. That was everything she possessed in the world. As she stepped outside carrying the keys, 2 men loading timber nearby exchanged amused glances. Bought herself a pile of wet stones. Should have spent it on boots. She'll be back in town by next week asking for charity. Martha heard every word. She kept walking, not out of pride, simply because defending herself would change nothing. The road leading toward Black Gull Point wound through windswept fields where tall grass bent continuously beneath the ocean breeze. Autumn clouds drifted low enough to touch the distant pine forests, and the cries of seabirds grew louder with every mile. The farther she traveled, the quieter the world became. Eventually, the wagon path narrowed into little more than twin tracks crossing rough ground. The lighthouse appeared gradually. First the lantern room, then the weathered stone tower. Finally, the attached keeper's cottage crouched beside it, like an aging companion refusing to leave. Time had not treated either structure gently. Several shutters hung crookedly. The roof bore patches where storms had stripped away shingles. Tall weeds surrounded the entrance path. Yet despite everything, the buildings remained standing. Strong, stubborn, much like the woman approaching them. Martha stopped at the old wooden gate. Rust protested as she pushed it open. No welcoming voice greeted her. Only the endless rhythm of waves striking cliffs below. She climbed the worn stone steps and fitted the largest key into the front door. For several seconds it refused to turn. Then, with a deep metallic groan that sounded almost like a sigh after many silent years, the lock finally yielded. The heavy oak door swung inward. Cool air smelling of old timber, salt, lamp oil, and forgotten winters drifted slowly into the afternoon sunlight. Dust floated through narrow beams of light, entering cracked windows. The silence inside felt different from ordinary silence. It was not empty. It was waiting. Martha stepped across the threshold. The floorboards creaked beneath her boots. She removed her hat instinctively, as though entering someone's home rather than an abandoned building. "I've come," she whispered without entirely knowing why. The words disappeared into stillness. She explored slowly. The keeper's kitchen still contained a cast-iron stove coated with years of dust. Shelves remained attached to the walls, though many stood empty. A long wooden table leaned unevenly against one corner. Bedrooms upstairs held little beyond broken bedsteads and faded wallpaper lifting gently from damp plaster. Nothing suggested hidden wealth. Nothing hinted at mystery. Only abandonment. Yet Martha noticed something others probably never would. The workmanship. Despite decades of neglect, the original builders had shaped every beam with remarkable precision. Door frames remained square. Stone joints showed barely any separation. The staircase leading into the tower had been constructed with unusual care, each tread worn smooth by generations of lighthouse keepers climbing faithfully toward the lantern. She rested one hand upon the polished wooden rail. Thousands upon thousands of hands had touched that same surface. Some joyful, some weary, some perhaps frightened during terrible storms. Buildings remembered. Her father had been right. Late afternoon sunlight poured through narrow tower windows as Martha began climbing the spiral staircase. One careful step, then another. The sound of her boots echoed gently upward into the empty lantern room. Halfway to the top she paused, not because she was tired, because something unusual caught her eye. On the inside face of the thick stone wall, almost hidden behind years of dust and the shadows cast by the winding staircase, she noticed a series of faint chisel marks unlike the surrounding masonry. At first glance they appeared accidental, but Martha had spent an entire lifetime studying craftsmanship. These marks had been made deliberately. Someone had measured something here. Very carefully. Very long ago. She leaned closer, brushing away decades of dust with the sleeve of her coat. As the fine gray powder drifted into the air, another detail slowly emerged. There, carved so lightly that only patient eyes could have found it after all these years, was a tiny compass rose no larger than the palm of her hand. And at its very center was a single brass nail driven perfectly flush into the stone. Most people would have dismissed it without another thought. A brass nail hidden in old masonry could easily be explained away. Builders marked measurements in countless peculiar ways. Repairmen left behind forgotten fasteners. Children carved curious symbols whenever adults looked elsewhere. Grey Haven had seen more than 100 years of weather, repairs, neglect, and changing hands. There was no shortage of ordinary explanations. But Martha Ellison had built her entire life upon the simple habit of looking twice. She rested one fingertip against the tiny compass rose. The carving itself had not been scratched hastily into the stone. Every line remained remarkably, even despite decades of salt air. Whoever made it possessed patient hands and proper tools. More importantly, they had chosen a place almost impossible to notice unless someone climbed the stairs slowly while looking inward rather than outward. Everyone else admired the sea. Whoever left this mark expected one careful person to study the wall instead. That thought lingered with her. She traced the compass points gently. North, south, east, west. Perfectly balanced. Only one thing appeared unusual. The eastern point extended ever so slightly farther than the others. Not enough to attract casual attention. Enough to interest someone trained by years of measuring timber. She smiled faintly. It seems you've been waiting. The empty tower offered no reply except the whisper of wind slipping through cracked lantern glass. Martha continued climbing until she reached the lantern room. The great Fresnel lens had been removed years before, leaving only its heavy circular mounting bolted to the iron floor. Broken glass glittered in dusty corners like forgotten pieces of ice. Rust stained the iron rail surrounding the observation deck, while seabirds had claimed several sheltered ledges as nesting places. Yet the view remained magnificent. Grey Haven spread below like a watercolor painted in muted blues and grays. Fishing boats moved slowly across the harbor. Smoke curled upward from chimneys preparing for another cold evening. Beyond the town stretched endless Atlantic water disappearing into a pale horizon where sea and sky seemed unable to agree where one ended and the other began. She stood quietly for several minutes. It occurred to her that Thomas Mercer had once watched this same sunset. Generations of keepers before him had done the same. Storms had come. Ships had passed. Lives had begun and ended beneath this very lantern. The tower had witnessed every one of them without speaking. Perhaps old buildings carried secrets simply because they listened longer than people. As daylight faded, Martha descended carefully to the keeper's cottage. There was no electricity, of course, but one small oil lamp remained hanging beside the kitchen hearth. After cleaning years of soot from its chimney and searching several cupboards, she found a forgotten tin containing enough lamp oil for a few evenings. The little flame pushed back darkness only a short distance. Still, it was enough. She unpacked the few belongings she possessed. 2 dresses, a wool blanket, several family photographs wrapped carefully inside cloth, her mother's journals, her father's measuring rule, a Bible with worn leather covers. Nothing else. $3 remained inside her purse. She placed them inside an empty drawer. For a long while she sat alone at the old kitchen table, listening to waves strike the cliffs. The lighthouse creaked gently around her. Old wood expands differently after sunset. Roof beams settle. Stone releases warmth gathered throughout the day. Anyone unfamiliar with ancient buildings might mistake those sounds for footsteps. Martha did not. She recognized the language of aging structures. Still, once or twice she thought she heard something different. Not movement. More like a dull, hollow vibration somewhere inside the tower itself. It came only when strong gusts swept in from the sea, then disappeared completely. She listened carefully. Nothing. Perhaps imagination. Perhaps not. She slept lightly beneath her blanket, waking before dawn as pale light slipped through cracked shutters. Without wasting the morning, she began cleaning. Dust filled bucket after bucket. Spiderwebs vanished from corners. Broken shutters were removed. Rainwater collected inside damaged barrels became useful for washing floors. She worked steadily, pausing only briefly for bread and tea purchased before leaving town. By afternoon, the kitchen looked almost welcoming. The lighthouse seemed grateful. That was a foolish thought. Yet she smiled anyway. On the second day, she tackled the tower itself. Every stair received careful attention. She scrubbed decades of salt residue from the wooden handrail until warm grain appeared beneath dull gray grime. As she climbed, she reached once again the tiny compass carving. It looked clearer now. The brass nail gleamed faintly where she had cleaned it. Curiosity returned stronger than before. She examined surrounding stones individually. Each block had been shaped from local granite. Each mortar joint appeared consistent. Except one. Directly beneath the extended eastern point of the compass rose lay a narrow vertical seam slightly thinner than every other joint nearby. Not cracked. Intentional. Martha stepped back. Builders preferred symmetry. This difference existed for a reason. She tapped surrounding stones gently using the wooden handle of her cleaning brush. Solid, solid, solid. Then, one section answered differently. The sound was softer. Hollow. She tapped again. The same result. Her pulse quickened. Not because she imagined treasure. Because hidden spaces fascinated every craftsperson. Someone had built an empty cavity behind this wall. Why? She fetched her father's measuring rule from downstairs. Running it across the stones confirmed what her ears already suspected. One rectangular section projected outward no more than the thickness of a thumbnail. Barely noticeable. Invisible unless someone searched deliberately. Whoever designed it possessed extraordinary skill. Martha looked again at the brass nail. Unlike ordinary nails, it had no visible head. Only a polished circle. Almost like a button. She hesitated. Old mechanisms sometimes became dangerous with age. Yet curiosity finally overcame caution. She pressed gently. Nothing happened. She pressed harder. Still nothing. She frowned thoughtfully, then remembered something her father often demonstrated while repairing swollen doors. Wood and metal don't always move where you push, he used to say. Sometimes they move where they're free. Instead of pressing inward, Martha tried twisting the tiny brass piece. It resisted. Then, very slowly, it turned. Only a quarter rotation. A soft metallic click echoed somewhere deep inside the stone. She froze. Silence. Then another sound. Not loud. Almost too quiet to hear. A slow grinding noise hidden within the wall itself. Dust drifted downward. The narrow mortar seam widened by scarcely the width of a coin. Martha stared without breathing. The rectangular stone section had shifted. Not much. Just enough to reveal the faintest dark line where none had existed moments before. She stepped backward instinctively. Another grinding sound followed. Then everything stopped. The hidden mechanism, untouched for countless years, seemed unwilling to move farther. She waited. Nothing. Carefully, she slipped her fingers into the narrow gap. Cold air brushed across her knuckles. There truly was an empty space behind the wall. The stone panel remained astonishingly heavy. Years of disuse had locked it firmly in place. She hurried downstairs searching for anything useful. Eventually, she found an old iron pry bar buried beneath collapsed shelves inside a storage room. Its handle was coated with rust. The metal remained sound. Returning to the staircase, she worked patiently rather than forcefully. Little by little, careful pressure, release. Again, dust poured from unseen cracks. Ancient gears hidden inside the masonry groaned as though awakening from a very long sleep. Finally, with one deep shudder, the concealed stone swung inward upon iron pivots so perfectly balanced that despite its enormous weight, it moved almost gracefully. A breath of cool, untouched air escaped from the darkness beyond. Martha lifted her oil lamp. Behind the wall lay a narrow passage no wider than a doorway. Stone steps descended only a few feet before opening into a surprisingly spacious chamber built inside the thickness of the lighthouse foundation itself. She stood motionless. No county official had mentioned such a room. No auction document described it. No townsperson had ever spoken of hidden passages. It was as though an entire piece of history had quietly slipped through time unnoticed. The chamber smelled dry. Remarkably dry. Someone had engineered careful ventilation. Wooden shelves lined two walls. Most stood empty. A sturdy oak table occupied the center. Unlike everything upstairs, almost no dust covered its surface. The room had remained sealed so completely that time itself seemed reluctant to enter. She crossed the threshold. Her lamp illuminated objects resting exactly where another pair of hands had arranged them decades before. An iron-bound sea chest, a leather satchel, a brass telescope, several rolled charts tied with faded blue ribbon, a carefully folded American flag whose colors had softened with age. Everything remained undisturbed. Everything waited. Martha approached the sea chest first. Its lock had not been forced. Instead, a small key still rested inside it. She turned it slowly. The lid opened with surprising ease. Inside lay no gold, no jewels, no stacks of money. Instead, there were dozens upon dozens of leather-bound journals, wrapped meticulously inside oilcloth to protect them from moisture. Each spine bore the same elegant handwriting, Thomas Mercer, and beneath his name, earlier volumes carried another, Nathaniel Mercer, then another before that, Jonathan Mercer, generation after generation. Lighthouse keepers. An unbroken family record stretching back nearly 80 years. Martha gently lifted the first journal. Tucked inside its cover rested a folded envelope addressed in careful ink. Its paper had yellowed with time, yet the writing remained unmistakably clear. To the first honest soul who finds this room. Her heartbeat slowed. Very carefully, she unfolded the letter. She had expected instructions, perhaps an explanation. Instead, the opening sentence caused her breath to catch completely. If you are reading these words, it began, then Grey Haven has forgotten the promise upon which it was built. Martha remained standing for several moments, the letter trembling ever so slightly between her fingers while the small oil lamp cast warm circles of light across the hidden chamber. Outside, somewhere far above the thick stone walls, the Atlantic continued its endless conversation with the cliffs, utterly unaware that a promise buried beneath generations of silence had finally found the one person patient enough to uncover it. She drew a slow breath and began reading. The handwriting possessed remarkable steadiness. Every stroke suggested a man who believed words deserved the same care as stonework. If you are reading these words, then Grey Haven has forgotten the promise upon which it was built. If the town still remembers, then this chamber was never meant to be opened. But if memory has faded, and if greed has grown louder than gratitude, then perhaps Providence has guided the right hands here at last. Martha lowered the page for a moment. Greed. The word lingered. She thought of the businessmen who had ruined Samuel. She thought of families forced from their boats. She thought of neighbors who no longer spoke with the same warmth they once had, each too burdened by survival to notice another person's struggle. Slowly she continued. My name is Thomas Mercer, fourth keeper of Black Gull Point, though the true beginning of this story belongs to my grandfather Jonathan, who first lit this lantern in the autumn of 1819. Before his passing, he entrusted me with everything contained within this room, together with a solemn instruction. He believed one day our town might become so distracted by wealth that it would forget what created its prosperity in the first place. If that day came, these records must be found by someone who valued truth above comfort. The sentence ended there, not dramatically, simply, as though truth rarely required decoration. Martha looked toward the journals filling the sea chest. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds, each carefully dated, each preserved with astonishing diligence. She opened the earliest volume. The ink had faded slightly, but every page remained legible. Jonathan Mercer did not write like a government official, nor like a sailor. He wrote almost as a father speaking to children not yet born. He described the first years of Black Gull Point Lighthouse, the harsh winters, the loneliness, the satisfaction of seeing distant captains answer the lantern's beam with thankful whistles. He recorded storms, repairs, births, funerals, unusual tides, and acts of quiet generosity performed by ordinary townspeople whose names had long disappeared from public memory. One entry especially caught Martha's attention. October 6, 1824. A widow named Abigail Foster arrived with nothing after her husband's vessel failed to return. The fishermen collected enough money to repair her cottage roof before winter. No one requested repayment. The town grows richest whenever nobody keeps count. Martha smiled faintly. Another entry. March 1831. Old Samuel Pike lost both hands to frost while rescuing strangers from the ice. Every family contributed something toward raising his children. Some gave flour, others lumber. A few offered only labor. Together it proved enough. She turned another page. Then another. Again and again the journals told similar stories. Not of famous people, not of spectacular fortunes, but of neighbors quietly carrying one another through difficult seasons. Grey Haven had once functioned almost like a single family. The realization stirred something deep inside her, because the town she knew still contained good people. Yet somewhere along the years, that spirit had weakened, not disappeared, simply been forgotten beneath worry and competition. She reached for another journal, then another. Hours slipped quietly past. The hidden chamber grew darker as evening settled outside. She scarcely noticed. One volume recorded every ship rescued by lighthouse keepers over nearly 60 years. Another listed names of families receiving anonymous assistance during harsh winters. There were maps showing reefs unknown to official charts, weather observations, Letters never delivered because intended recipients had died before returning from sea. Everything had been preserved with extraordinary devotion. Yet none of it explained why someone had built an elaborate secret chamber. Not yet. Finally, Martha unfolded the second letter resting beneath the journals. Its seal bore the image of the lighthouse itself. Inside, Thomas Mercer wrote differently, more urgently. If you have reached this page, then you deserve to know why these records remained hidden. She leaned closer. Many believe this lighthouse protected Grey Haven only by warning ships away from dangerous rocks. That is true. But it is not the whole truth. For nearly 70 years, another duty belonged quietly to every keeper. Martha felt her pulse quicken. She continued. Each successful voyage entering this harbor contributed a tiny voluntary share toward what our founders called the common tide. She frowned thoughtfully. The common tide. She had never heard those words before. The letter explained. Captains whose vessels reached harbor safely often left a small amount of money, not taxes, not mandatory fees, but gifts freely offered in gratitude for the lighthouse guiding them home. Some donated only a few coins. Others gave far more. The funds never belonged to government, nor to the Mercers. Instead, they supported families struck by tragedy. If storms destroyed boats, the common tide helped rebuild them. If illness left children hungry, the common tide quietly purchased food. If widows lost everything, the common tide repaired homes before winter. No speeches, no recognition, only neighbors protecting neighbors. Every donation, every expense, every signature, recorded meticulously inside ledgers hidden beneath the lighthouse. Martha looked immediately toward the sea chest. Could those journals contain? She searched beneath the upper layer until her fingers touched something heavier. 3 enormous leather-bound books rested beneath the diaries. Unlike the journals, each carried brass corner protectors. Embossed across the covers appeared simple words. Common Tide Ledger. She carefully lifted the first volume onto the table. The pages astonished her. Column after column. Perfect handwriting. Dates. Names. Amounts received. Amounts distributed. Witnesses. Receipts. Every transaction balanced exactly. No missing entries. No unexplained withdrawals. The records stretched decade after decade. Remarkable. Whoever maintained them possessed extraordinary discipline. Then, near the final pages, the handwriting changed. Thomas Mercer's calm script became noticeably firmer, less peaceful. One page contained only a single sentence. Today they asked me to surrender the ledger. No further explanation. The following page continued. Representatives from the county insist all charitable holdings must now become public assets under new administrative policies. Another page. I refused. Another. They argued efficiency. Another. I argued trust. Then, the final completed entry. If these books fall into dishonest hands, generations of sacrifice will disappear. Therefore I have sealed them where only patience, honesty, and careful observation may recover them. Martha slowly closed the ledger. Her thoughts raced. Someone, many years ago, had attempted to absorb the community's charitable fund into official control. Thomas Mercer had hidden everything instead. Not for himself. For the future. She searched frantically through the remaining papers. Surely there had once been money. Investments. Property deeds. Something supporting decades of donations. At first she found nothing. Only correspondence. Receipts. Meeting minutes. Maps. Then, folded separately beneath a bundle of charts, lay an envelope marked simply, Final Account. Inside rested several legal documents bearing faded county seals. Martha spread them carefully across the table. One deed transferred ownership of several waterfront warehouses into a charitable trust. Another documented timber rights granted by neighboring landowners. A third described revenue from fish processing docks. Piece by piece, an astonishing picture emerged. The common tide had grown steadily for generations, not merely through donations. Wise trustees had quietly invested portions into productive property benefiting the entire harbor. Income supported schools, wharves, medical supplies, emergency repairs. Everything had belonged legally to the charitable trust. Everything. Until her eyes stopped. Near the bottom of the final page appeared a familiar surname. Harwood. She knew that name. Everyone in Grey Haven did. Edwin Harwood now chaired the County Development Committee. His late father, Charles Harwood, had once served as town treasurer. According to the document before her, Charles Harwood had accepted temporary administrative oversight of several trust properties while legal questions were supposedly resolved. Temporary. The document bore the date 43 years earlier. There was no record showing the assets had ever been returned. Martha frowned deeply. That seemed impossible. Surely someone would have noticed. Unless... She reached again for later journals. Thomas Mercer had. Several entries mentioned repeated requests for financial reports. Ignored. Another recorded meetings postponed indefinitely. One heartbreaking passage simply read, "Too many good people assume someone else is paying attention." Martha closed her eyes. But responsibility quietly drifting away because everyone believed another person was watching. She continued searching. At the very bottom of the sea chest lay a flat cedar box. Unlike everything else, it had been wrapped twice inside waxed canvas. Its brass latch opened smoothly. Inside rested a beautifully drawn survey map of Grey Haven. Not the harbor she knew. The harbor as it existed nearly 80 years earlier. Dozens of properties had been marked carefully using colored ink. Red, blue, green. Tiny symbols covered nearly every street. Along one margin appeared handwritten notes identifying trust holdings. Warehouses, boatyards, cold storage buildings, rental cottages, wharves, even several fishing islands. The charitable foundation had once quietly owned enough productive property to ensure no family in Grey Haven would ever face complete ruin. Martha's breath caught. What had become of it all? She already feared she knew. But fear and proof are different things. Thomas Mercer had hidden records, not conclusions. He expected whoever found them to uncover the rest honestly. She looked again around the hidden chamber. This room had protected more than history. It had preserved accountability. Outside, darkness settled fully across Black Gull Point. The lighthouse stood silent above the restless Atlantic. Yet for the first time in many decades, its greatest light had nothing to do with the lantern above. It had begun shining from a forgotten room beneath the spiral stairs. And Martha Ellison realized with quiet certainty that whoever had benefited from the disappearance of the common tide would not welcome its return. Sleep came only in short intervals that night. Whenever Martha closed her eyes, she saw pages filled with careful handwriting stretching across nearly a century. Names of ordinary people who had trusted one another enough to build something larger than themselves. And the signature of Charles Harwood resting quietly at the edge of the final legal transfer, like a pebble capable of changing the direction of an entire river. She rose before sunrise. The hidden chamber remained exactly as she had left it. Morning light filtered faintly through the narrow tower windows above, while the concealed room below remained untouched by the changing hour. The air felt strangely peaceful, almost reverent, as though the generations who had preserved those records had expected whoever eventually entered to do so with steady hands rather than hurried excitement. Martha lit the oil lamp once more. She did not begin by searching for treasure. Instead, she organized. One pile for journals, one for legal papers, one for maps, one for correspondence. Her father had always insisted that confusion was the greatest enemy of good workmanship. The same, she suspected, applied to truth. Several hours passed before she noticed another detail hidden within the cedar box. The false bottom. It revealed itself only because the wood sounded slightly different beneath her knuckles. She smiled to herself. "You're full of surprises." Using the tip of a small pocket knife, she gently lifted one corner. A thin cedar panel rose smoothly. Beneath it rested three objects. A brass key unlike any she had yet found, a wax-sealed envelope, and a small leather notebook scarcely larger than the palm of her hand. She reached for the notebook first. Unlike the formal ledgers, this one had clearly been carried in someone's pocket for years. Its leather corners had softened from constant use, and several pages bore water stains left by rain or sea spray. Across the inside cover appeared only two words: Keeper's Notes. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Thomas Mercer. These entries differed from everything else. Short, personal, often unfinished. "Fog so thick today, I heard the schooner before seeing her." Young David Fletcher finally smiled again after losing his father. Roof repaired before snow thanks to anonymous gifts from 3 fishermen. Then, farther along, Harwood visited again. Martha turned the page. Asked whether anyone besides myself knew where the original trust documents were kept. Another page. He says central administration will protect them better. Another. Protection is not always the same thing as possession. The notebook grew increasingly uneasy. Thomas had begun recording conversations rather than weather. Harwood insists records are becoming inconvenient. Too many questions being asked. Suggested the town would forget eventually. Martha stopped reading. Forget. The very word used in the letter. Thomas had seen what was happening. Not dramatic theft. Something slower. Something easier to hide. She continued. The final pages contain no accusations. Only observations. The town is changing. New men speak often of efficiency. Old promises require patience, which few now consider profitable. Then, on the final written page, Thomas had copied a sentence that clearly meant enough for him to preserve. When people stop remembering why something was built, someone else eventually decides what it is worth. Martha closed the notebook gently. Outside, waves rolled against the cliffs below exactly as they had the day Thomas Mercer wrote those words. The sea had remembered. People had not. She finally opened the wax-sealed envelope. Inside rested a single folded document bearing remarkably crisp paper. It proved to be the original charter establishing the common tide, signed in 1820. Not by politicians, not by businessmen, by captains, shipwrights, schoolteachers, ministers, widows, ordinary citizens. Every signature represented someone who believed no family in Grey Haven should ever face complete ruin alone. Near the bottom appeared one final paragraph. Should this trust ever cease to serve the people for whom it was created, authority shall pass to whoever can lawfully prove its original purpose through surviving records and witnesses. Martha read that sentence 3 times. Authority shall pass to whoever can lawfully prove. Her heartbeat quickened, not because she imagined herself becoming wealthy, because the document suggested something extraordinary. If the records remained legally valid, then perhaps the trust had never truly disappeared at all. Perhaps it had merely been forgotten. She immediately dismissed the thought as wishful. Surely laws were more complicated than that. Still, the possibility refused to leave her mind. By late afternoon, she locked the hidden chamber carefully and made the long walk into Grey Haven. People noticed her. How could they not? The woman who had spent her final dollars buying a deserted lighthouse now walked calmly through town carrying a leather satchel filled with old papers. Some smiled politely. Others exchanged amused glances. A pair of fishermen repairing nets paused long enough for one of them to grin. How's the palace? His companion laughed. Roof still standing? Martha answered pleasantly. So far. Neither expected further conversation. She continued toward the public library. It occupied 2 modest rooms beside the church and was supervised by Miss Ruth Pembroke, a woman whose memory seemed nearly as extensive as the shelves surrounding her. Ruth looked up with delighted surprise. Martha, it's good to see you. And you. The librarian noticed the satchel. Research? A little. Then you've come to the right place. For the next several hours, Martha requested every available town register, historical map, property index, and newspaper archive relating to Black Gull Point and Grey Haven's early years. Ruth asked no unnecessary questions. She simply helped. That alone reminded Martha why she had always respected her. Together, they searched dusty volumes rarely opened by modern visitors. Gradually, small pieces began fitting together. The earliest newspapers frequently mentioned the common tide, not in great detail, almost casually. Assistance provided through the common tide. Repairs funded by the Harbor Trust. Scholarships granted through community subscriptions. Clearly, everyone once knew what those words meant. Then, around 45 years earlier, the references abruptly vanished. No farewell announcement. No explanation. Simply silence. As though the institution had quietly dissolved without anyone noticing. Martha found that deeply unsettling. Communities seldom forget something so important overnight. Unless someone encouraged them to. She thanked Ruth before sunset. The librarian walked with her to the front door. You've been studying very old history. I have. Ruth hesitated. My grandfather used to mention something called the Tide Fund. Martha looked up quickly. What did he say? Only that people trusted it more than banks. She frowned thoughtfully. I always assumed he remembered incorrectly. Martha smiled gently. Sometimes the oldest memories prove the strongest. Ruth watched her thoughtfully. I have a feeling you found something. Perhaps. You'll tell me? When I understand it myself. The librarian nodded. I'll be here. That simple promise warmed Martha more than the afternoon sunlight. Not everyone had forgotten how to stand beside another person. As she crossed the town square on her way back toward the lighthouse, a polished black carriage stopped nearby. The driver stepped down immediately, opening the rear door. From inside emerged Edwin Harwood. He appeared perhaps 60 years old, neatly dressed, his dark overcoat tailored far better than anything commonly seen in Grey Haven. His silver hair remained carefully combed despite the wind, and the polished walking stick he carried seemed chosen as much for appearance as necessity. Many people greeted him respectfully. Some removed their hats. He acknowledged them with practiced courtesy. Then his eyes settled upon Martha. Recognition flickered immediately. Miss Ellison, Mr. Harwood. He smiled warmly. I heard about your unusual purchase. So did most of the town. He laughed politely. I suppose news travels quickly in places like ours. It always has. His gaze shifted briefly toward the leather satchel hanging from her shoulder. You've been busy. A little cleaning. Old buildings often contain interesting memories. The remark seemed innocent. Yet something inside Martha stirred. Was he merely making conversation? Or fishing gently for information? He continued pleasantly. My father admired Black Gull Point greatly. So I've read. That answer caused the faintest pause. Only a heartbeat. Almost invisible. You've been reading? Some old journals. How fascinating. He smiled again. If you discover anything worth preserving, the county archives would certainly appreciate receiving it. His tone remained courteous. Perfectly reasonable. Yet Martha suddenly remembered Thomas Mercer's notebook. Harwood asked whether anyone besides myself knew where the original trust documents were kept. She chose her next words carefully. I'm still learning what belongs there. Edwin inclined his head. History has a way of becoming confusing. Sometimes. I've always believed old papers are safest in official hands. Martha met his eyes calmly. And I've always believed they should stay with whoever understands them. For the first time, the warmth behind his smile cooled ever so slightly. Only for an instant. Then it returned. Quite. He tipped his hat. I wish you every success with your lighthouse. And I wish you a pleasant evening. The carriage rolled away. Martha stood motionless until it disappeared around the corner. The conversation had lasted scarcely 3 minutes. Yet something about it left her deeply uneasy. Not because Edwin Harwood had threatened her. He had done nothing of the sort. Rather, he had shown interest far too quickly. No one else in town cared about forgotten documents. Why did he? She resumed walking. Behind her, inside the carriage, Edwin Harwood glanced once through the rear window, watching the woman carrying the worn leather satchel. His expression had become thoughtful, very thoughtful indeed. And although Martha could not see it, he quietly instructed the driver, "Take me to the county records office." The horses turned without delay. For the first time since the hidden chamber had been sealed decades earlier, someone besides Martha had begun asking questions again. And questions, once awakened, have a curious habit of leading honest people toward truth, while leading dishonest ones toward fear. The following morning arrived beneath a blanket of dense gray fog that drifted inland from the Atlantic until even the nearest cliffs seemed to disappear into white silence. The lighthouse, though dark and long abandoned, stood within the mist exactly as it had for generations, its broad stone walls rising like the memory of an older world that refused to surrender entirely to time. Martha woke before dawn. She had always trusted difficult questions more than easy answers. The encounter with Edwin Harwood lingered in her thoughts, not because he had spoken harshly, but because every sentence had been measured. Men with nothing to hide rarely worried about forgotten journals resting inside abandoned towers. She prepared a simple breakfast of bread and tea before carrying one of the common tide ledgers upstairs into the keeper's kitchen, where daylight made reading easier. This time she did not search randomly. She searched for names. Harwood. The surname appeared surprisingly often. Not Charles. Earlier generations. Benjamin Harwood had donated timber after the terrible winter of 1838. Rebecca Harwood organized food deliveries during a fever outbreak. Nathan Harwood contributed part of his shipyard profits to rebuild fishermen's homes after a hurricane damaged nearly half the harbor. Martha paused. The family itself had once been deeply involved in helping the town. Whatever happened later had not begun with them. It had begun somewhere between one generation and the next. That realization mattered. History seldom belonged entirely to heroes or villains. Good families could lose their way. Honorable names could become attached to unfortunate choices. She continued reading. Near the later entries, Charles Harwood appeared frequently, not as a donor, but as treasurer overseeing temporary administrative matters. At first, everything seemed proper. Receipts balanced. Signatures matched. Property income continued arriving. Then, about 3 years before Thomas Mercer sealed the chamber, the entries became strangely incomplete. Entire quarters lacked summaries. Rental income from several warehouses simply disappeared from later reports. Some buildings listed as trust property no longer appeared at all. No explanation accompanied the omissions. Only silence. Martha laid 2 ledgers side by side. The differences became unmistakable. One recorded a warehouse producing steady income for decades. The next volume skipped it entirely. Not crossed out. Not sold. Simply gone. She reached immediately for the folded survey map. There it was. Warehouse number 4. Marked carefully in blue ink. She frowned thoughtfully. She knew exactly where that warehouse stood. Or rather, where one stood now. The building still existed near the eastern docks. Only everyone believed it belonged to Harwood Maritime Storage. Could it once have belonged to the Common Tide? If so, when had ownership changed? And how? The question settled heavily upon her mind. She gathered only the documents necessary for comparison, carefully locking every remaining journal back inside the hidden chamber before walking toward town once again. This time she did not visit the library. She visited the county registry. The records office occupied a brick building adjoining the courthouse, where shelves stretched from floor to ceiling holding thousands of property deeds gathered across generations. The young clerk behind the counter looked pleasantly surprised. "Miss Ellison, good morning. How may I help you?" "I'd like to examine historical ownership records for several harbor properties." He smiled apologetically. "That may take a while. I have time." He laughed softly. "I suppose old papers always do." Several minutes later, he returned carrying enormous leather volumes whose pages smelled faintly of dust and ink. Martha thanked him, then began searching. Hours slipped quietly past. She compared dates, lot numbers, transfer references, legal descriptions. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Then, warehouse number 4. Her finger stopped. Original owner, the Common Tide Harbor Trust. Transfer date, September 14th, 42 years earlier. New owner, Harwood Maritime Holdings. Sale price, $1. Martha blinked. $1? She read the page again. Surely she misunderstood. Commercial waterfront property, even in difficult years, had never been worth merely $1. She searched for supporting documents. There should have been contracts, appraisals, council approvals. Instead, the reference file was missing, not misplaced among neighboring folders. Gone entirely. Only the transfer entry remained. Her pulse quickened. She searched the next property. The same pattern. A wharf. Transferred. $1. Supporting documents absent. Then another. Rental cottages. $1. Missing file. Another. Storage yard. $1. Missing. One after another. Each charitable property had quietly entered private ownership for token amounts impossible to justify. Each original file had disappeared. Someone had been remarkably thorough. Martha leaned back slowly. This was no simple bookkeeping error. She copied every reference carefully into her notebook. When she finally closed the last register, the young clerk approached politely. "Find what you needed?" "I'm not certain." He looked curious. "Old records can be difficult." "They can." He smiled. "My grandfather always said paperwork tells stories." "It does. Most people just don't read long enough." She thanked him sincerely before leaving. Outside, sunlight had finally broken through the morning fog. The harbor shimmered quietly beneath clear autumn skies. Yet Martha found little comfort in the beautiful afternoon, because she now carried something more dangerous than suspicion. She carried patterns, and patterns eventually demanded explanations. As she passed the waterfront, she deliberately slowed near warehouse number 4. The structure remained solid, recently painted. Workers loaded barrels through wide double doors while clerks recorded shipments at nearby tables. Business appeared prosperous. A polished sign above the entrance read, Harwood Maritime Storage. Nothing suggested the building had ever belonged to anyone else. Martha watched silently from across the street. An elderly dockworker happened to notice her. Looking for someone? She recognized him immediately. Isaac Donnelly, nearly 80, once a fisherman, now too old for sea work, but still helping around the docks whenever needed. "Good afternoon, Isaac." His weathered face brightened. "Martha, heard you've become keeper of the old lighthouse." "So it seems." He chuckled. "Braver soul than me." She smiled, then asked gently, "How long has this warehouse belonged to the Harwoods?" Isaac looked toward the building. "Oh." He scratched thoughtfully beneath his cap. "Long time now. Do you remember before that?" His expression changed. The effort of reaching back through decades became almost visible. He narrowed his eyes. "You know, I think my father used to call it the Tide Warehouse." Martha remained perfectly still. "The Tide Warehouse." "Aye." He nodded slowly. "Strange name. What did it mean?" He frowned. "Never rightly knew. My father always said if somebody's boat burned or a widow lost her house." He stopped. His eyes widened slightly. "There was some sort of fund. The common tide?" The old man's eyebrows lifted. "That's it." He laughed softly. "Haven't heard those words in goodness." He looked toward the sea. 40 years maybe. What happened to it? Isaac's smile faded. "Couldn't tell you. One year folks talked about it. The next," he shrugged. "They didn't." He seemed genuinely puzzled, as though remembering a dream almost forgotten. "We all just assumed things changed." Martha thanked him warmly. Walking away, she realized something profound. The town had not chosen to forget. Memory had simply faded because no one kept telling the story. Children grew up. Older people died. Records disappeared. Within a single generation, even something as important as the common tide became little more than a faint echo inside elderly minds. That evening she returned to the lighthouse carrying fresh bread, lamp oil, and one additional purchase. A sturdy lock, not for the front door, for the hidden chamber. She installed it carefully after sunset. The concealed stone door already protected the room from casual discovery. Still, she trusted caution, especially now. Later, while reviewing Thomas Mercer's correspondence by lamplight, another folded sheet slipped unexpectedly from between two journal pages. It was not addressed, nor signed. Apparently Thomas had copied it before hiding the originals. The contents consisted of only 6 lines. "Mr. Mercer, the committee has voted to conclude all remaining inquiries concerning the Harbor Trust. Further discussion serves no practical purpose. The properties have already been reassigned. Please consider the matter permanently settled." No signature, only initials. C.H. Charles Harwood. Martha stared quietly at the page. There it was. Not proof of theft. Not yet. But unmistakable proof that Thomas Mercer had questioned what happened, and had been deliberately told to stop asking. Outside, darkness deepened across Black Gull Point. Far below, waves continued striking ancient stone exactly as they had for centuries. The lighthouse had waited patiently through all those years. Its hidden chamber had preserved every forgotten promise. Now another truth slowly became clear to Martha. The greatest treasure behind the spiral stairs had never been gold. It was memory, and memory, once awakened, could become powerful enough to change the future. What she did not know was that she was no longer the only person searching through old records. Across town, inside Edwin Harwood's private office, a clerk had just informed him that someone had requested historical property ledgers from the county archives. Harwood dismissed the young man calmly. Then, after the door closed, he walked alone to a locked cabinet hidden behind a bookshelf. From the bottom drawer he removed an old leather folder. Its edges were badly worn. Across the cover, written in faded ink, were 2 words he had not seen in many years. Common tide. His face, usually composed and confident, became very still, almost anxious. He whispered only one sentence into the empty room. So, someone finally found it. And for the first time in decades, Edwin Harwood was no longer certain the past would remain buried. For the next several days, Martha moved through Grey Haven with the same quiet composure she had always carried, though those who knew her well sensed something had changed. She no longer walked like a woman searching for work alone. There was purpose in her steady pace now, the kind that comes only after someone has found a responsibility larger than herself. She told no one about the hidden chamber, not because she wished to keep its secrets forever, but because truth deserved careful handling. Her father had often reminded her that exposing a cracked beam before supporting the roof could bring the entire house down. Martha believed the same principle applied to history. Each morning, she copied another portion of the common tide ledgers into fresh notebooks. She compared dates, traced property lines on the old survey map, and matched them against county records until patterns emerged with remarkable clarity. By the end of the week, she could account for nearly every parcel once belonging to the trust. Some had been sold legitimately decades earlier to support struggling families exactly as the charter allowed. Others had somehow drifted into private ownership without proper authorization. The differences were impossible to ignore. Yet impossible was not the same as proven. She needed someone who understood the law better than she did. That person turned out to be Judge Amos Whitcomb, long retired and living quietly on the western edge of town. Martha remembered helping repair his porch years earlier after a winter storm. He had earned a reputation for fairness rather than popularity, a distinction she valued deeply. When she arrived at his modest farmhouse, the old judge welcomed her with genuine warmth. "I was wondering how long it would take before you knocked." She looked at him curiously. "You expected me?" He smiled faintly. "I expected that Lighthouse to choose someone eventually." Those words surprised her more than anything she had read in the hidden chamber. "You knew?" "I knew Thomas Mercer." The judge's expression softened with memory. "He never showed me where he kept his records. But he once told me that if the town ever forgot itself, the Lighthouse would remember." Martha sat quietly while he poured tea into 2 plain cups. Without unnecessary drama, she unfolded several copied pages and placed them carefully upon the table. Judge Whitcomb read every line without interruption. He compared signatures, examined dates, studied the charter. When he finally looked up, his face had grown solemn. "These are extraordinary. They're genuine. I believe they are." He rested one weathered hand upon the charter. "If the originals still exist." "They do." "Then this changes everything." Martha hesitated. "Does it?" He nodded slowly. "Perhaps not overnight. But legally?" "Legally." He paused, choosing each word with care. "Legally, these records deserve to be heard." He leaned back thoughtfully. "Many people assume justice begins in court. It doesn't. It begins with evidence." Outside, rain began tapping softly against the farmhouse windows. The judge folded his hands. "You must protect those originals." "I intend to, and trust very few people until they're safely documented." She nodded. "I've already told no one." "Good." He smiled gently. "Continue telling no one." Over the following week, the retired judge helped Martha organize every document into chronological order. They prepared copies, identified missing transactions, and listed witnesses whose descendants might still possess family letters or receipts. The work proved painstaking, but slowly, an unmistakable picture emerged. The common tide had never been dissolved by lawful vote. It had simply stopped being discussed. Its assets had been absorbed piece by piece until almost no living resident remembered they had once belonged to the entire community. Meanwhile, Edwin Harwood found himself sleeping less comfortably than usual. His father's old leather folder contained only fragments, copies of correspondence, incomplete property schedules, and several unsigned memoranda recommending the consolidation of charitable assets into more efficient management. Nothing explicitly admitted wrongdoing, yet neither did it explain where the original trust authority had gone. For years that uncertainty had remained buried beneath forgotten history. Now someone else was asking the same questions Charles Harwood had once worked so hard to silence. Edwin stood often at his office window overlooking the harbor. He watched fishermen unloading modest catches, children chasing gulls along the pier, widows carrying baskets through the market. He had lived among these people his entire life. He did not consider himself a villain. His father had always insisted the old trust had become outdated, disorganized, impossible to administer fairly. The properties, he claimed, needed professional management for the town to prosper. Edwin had believed him. Perhaps he still did. Yet belief had become far more uncomfortable now that evidence was resurfacing. One evening he walked alone to Black Gull Point. The climb felt longer than he remembered. The abandoned lighthouse appeared strangely alive despite its broken lantern. Warm lamplight glowed through one kitchen window. Someone was home. He stopped at the gate but went no farther. For nearly a minute he simply looked toward the tower standing against the evening sky. Then, without knocking, he turned and walked back toward town. Some questions, he realized, could no longer be answered with polite conversation alone. And somewhere beneath the spiral stairs, patiently protected by stone, iron, and time itself. The original journals waited for the moment when the truth would finally be spoken aloud before the people of Grey Haven. The announcement appeared 3 mornings later. It was nothing more than a single sheet of paper pinned beside the church bell, where notices of town meetings, lost livestock, and community suppers had always been posted. Most people walked past it without slowing, but by noon nearly everyone in Grey Haven had read the short message. A public meeting will be held next Thursday evening in the town hall concerning historical harbor records and charitable property. All interested citizens are welcome to attend. No signature appeared beneath the notice. Only the official seal of the retired Judge Amos Whitcomb, who had agreed to moderate the gathering at Martha's request. By sunset, conversation had spread through every dock, workshop, and kitchen. Some dismissed it as another discussion about taxes. Others guessed it concerned fishing licenses. Only Edwin Harwood understood immediately what it truly meant. He folded the notice carefully after reading it and slipped it into his coat pocket. So, he murmured to himself, she intends to bring the past into daylight. During the days leading to the meeting, Martha never hurried. She repaired loose shingles on the keeper's cottage. She cleaned another section of the tower windows. She copied one final set of documents by hand. The work steadied her thoughts. She knew that anger would persuade no one. Facts would. The old judge visited the Lighthouse twice. Together they reviewed every ledger once again. If anyone challenges these, he said, resting his hand upon the oldest volume, we answer with another document. And if they challenge that, we answer with another. Martha smiled. There seemed to be rather a lot of them. Thomas Mercer had been astonishingly thorough. Receipts matched journals. Journals matched property registers. Property registers matched maps. Even weather records confirmed dates when certain buildings had been repaired using common tide funds. It was less a collection of papers than the memory of an entire community preserved one careful page at a time. Thursday evening arrived beneath clear skies. Long before the meeting began, every bench inside town hall had filled. Fishermen stood along the back wall. Shopkeepers occupied the front rows. Widows sat together near the windows. Even teenagers who normally avoided civic meetings came out of curiosity after hearing rumors about buried treasure beneath the old lighthouse. They would soon discover that the truth proved far more valuable than gold. Judge Whitcomb rose first. His voice carried the calm authority of a man long accustomed to difficult conversations. We are not gathered here to accuse. The room quieted. We are gathered to remember. He turned toward Martha. Miss Ellison. She stood slowly, carrying only one leather-bound ledger. Nothing more. She looked around the crowded hall. Many faces were familiar. Some had once brought meals during Samuel's illness. Others had purchased boats repaired by her father decades earlier. Most simply waited. I found something, she began quietly. Not money. Not jewels. A record. She opened the ledger. This book belonged to the people of Grey Haven. A few listeners exchanged puzzled glances. She continued. For nearly 70 years our town maintained something called the common tide. At those words, several elderly residents looked toward one another. An old woman in the second row whispered softly. I remember hearing my grandmother say those words. Another nodded. So do I. Martha explained how lighthouse keepers had safeguarded the charitable trust. She described the journals, the donations, the repairs. The widows helped through harsh winters. The children whose schooling had been quietly paid for. She spoke without embellishment, simply, patiently, as though reading family history aloud. Then she placed copies of the original charter upon the front table. Judge Whitcomb invited anyone present to examine them. Several stepped forward. One elderly fisherman adjusted his spectacles before suddenly stopping. My father's signature. His voice cracked. This is my father's name. Another woman gasped. My grandmother too. The room grew remarkably still. History had ceased being abstract. It now belonged to their own families. Only then did Martha unfold the property map. Colored markings covered the harbor. She pointed gently. Many of these places once belonged to the common tide. Murmurs spread across the room. Warehouse number 4. The Eastern Wharf. Rental cottages. Timber lots. People recognized them immediately. Edwin Harwood finally rose from his seat. Every eye turned toward him. He walked calmly to the front of the room. His voice remained composed. My father administered many community properties. I know. He believed central management protected them. I believe he may have believed that. The answer surprised everyone. There was no accusation, no anger, only honesty. Edwin looked directly at Martha. Are you saying my father deliberately stole them? The room seemed to stop breathing. Martha answered carefully. I am saying the records show the trust lost its purpose. She paused. I am saying important questions were never answered. She placed another document on the table. And I believe the people of Grey Haven deserve those answers. Judge Whitcomb spoke before anyone else could interrupt. That, he said firmly, is precisely why we are here. He adjusted his spectacles. The evidence deserves formal legal review. No conclusions will be reached tonight. But these records are authentic enough to require an independent examination. Silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. Isaac Donnelly slowly stood. The elderly dockworker removed his cap. I've been trying all week to remember. Everyone looked toward him. My father worked on the Tide warehouse. He swallowed. He used to tell me. His voice faltered before growing stronger. No family in Grey Haven stands alone. Several older residents quietly repeated the words. They remembered them too. One memory awakened another. Stories long buried beneath ordinary life began returning. A widow recalled anonymous firewood arriving every winter after her grandfather died. A retired captain remembered his first fishing boat being repaired through the harbor fund. Another resident produced an old receipt from his wallet, preserved because his father had always insisted it represented the best dollar our family ever gave. Piece by piece, memory returned. Not because Martha demanded it, because truth had finally been given room to breathe. Edwin Harwood listened without interruption. As more voices filled the hall, his shoulders slowly lowered. He looked toward the old ledger resting on the table, then quietly removed his father's leather folder from inside his coat. Without a word, he placed it beside Martha's documents. I think, he said softly, these belong with the rest. The room fell silent once more. Inside the folder rested correspondence never before seen by anyone else. Letters, internal memoranda, private notes. None erased what had happened, but together they revealed something profoundly human. Charles Harwood had begun by believing he could manage the trust more efficiently. Over time, temporary control became permanent ownership. The original purpose faded, not through one dramatic act, but through years of small compromises that no one challenged. Judge Whitcomb closed the folder gently. The law, he said, will decide what can be restored. He looked around the crowded hall. But tonight, his voice softened. Our community has already recovered something even more important. No one asked what he meant. They all understood. Grey Haven had remembered itself. The legal review lasted far longer than anyone in Grey Haven expected. Weeks became months, and winter settled over the coast with quiet determination. Snow gathered along the stone walls of Black Gull Point, while waves continued to hurl themselves against the cliffs exactly as they had for generations. Yet something subtle had already begun changing throughout the town. People spoke to one another differently. Not dramatically, simply with a little more patience. The story of the common tide spread from kitchen tables to fishing boats, from church gatherings to schoolrooms. Children asked grandparents questions they had never thought to ask before. Old trunks were opened. Forgotten letters were unfolded. Receipts tucked inside family Bibles appeared after decades of silence. Every small discovery strengthened the history Martha had uncovered. Judge Whitcomb oversaw the review with meticulous care. Independent surveyors confirmed the original property boundaries. Historians authenticated the Lighthouse journals. Accountants compared decades of surviving financial records. Even officials from the state archives traveled to Grey Haven after hearing that an intact collection of 19th-century charitable ledgers had survived inside a sealed chamber. Their conclusions surprised no one who had read Thomas Mercer's careful notes. The common tide had indeed existed exactly as described. The trust had never been lawfully dissolved. Several properties had passed into private ownership through procedures that, while accepted at the time, failed to satisfy the original legal requirements established in the trust charter. The matter could easily have turned bitter. Many expected lawsuits, angry speeches, and neighbors choosing sides. Instead, Martha requested something altogether different. When Judge Whitcomb asked what outcome she hoped for, she answered without hesitation. I don't want revenge. He looked at her over the rim of his spectacles. What do you want? She glanced toward the harbor visible through his office window. I want the promise returned. Those 5 words shaped everything that followed. Rather than forcing families from homes they had occupied for decades or demanding impossible repayments, the review recommended a restoration plan that honored both history and present reality. Properties that could reasonably return to community ownership did so. Others remained with their current occupants under long-term agreements that required annual contributions to a newly re-established common tide trust. Income from the harbor warehouses, rental cottages, and several waterfront leases would once again fund emergency assistance, scholarships for local children, repairs after storms, and support for widows, injured fishermen, and struggling families. The purpose had returned, not exactly as it once existed, but faithful to its original spirit. When the decision became public, many eyes turned toward Edwin Harwood. He accepted it quietly. During one town meeting, he stood before his neighbors and spoke more honestly than anyone expected. "My father believed he was protecting the town," he said. "I believed him." He paused. Intentions do not erase mistakes. The room remained silent. "I cannot change what happened before me." His voice steadied. "But I can choose what happens after me." Without further ceremony, he donated additional harbor property from his own holdings to strengthen the restored trust. No applause followed. None was needed. Some acts speak most clearly in silence. Spring eventually returned to the Maine coast. The first fishing boats departed beneath brighter skies, and children once again raced along the docks where winter had left only empty footprints. Repairs funded by the renewed common tide restored weather-beaten piers before the busy season began. A young widow whose husband had been lost in an autumn storm received enough assistance to keep her family's home. Two brothers whose boat had burned at the wharf found volunteers waiting before sunrise to help rebuild it. No newspaper called these events remarkable. Gray Haven simply began acting like Gray Haven again. The Lighthouse changed as well. With donations of labor rather than money, townspeople climbed Black Gull Point every Saturday throughout the summer. Stone masons repaired cracked walls. Carpenters replaced rotted beams. Glaziers restored broken windows. Children carried buckets of paint almost larger than themselves. No one kept count of the hours. Someone eventually asked Martha whether the lighthouse should become a museum. She smiled. "It should become whatever helps people remember." The hidden chamber remained exactly where Thomas Mercer had left it. Only now it was carefully preserved rather than forgotten. Scholars documented every journal before returning the originals to their shelves. A discreet iron gate protected the entrance behind the spiral stairs, and only a handful of trusted caretakers knew how to reach it. Its greatest purpose had already been fulfilled. It no longer needed secrecy, only respect. One warm September evening, nearly a year after she had first climbed the abandoned tower carrying only $3 and a lifetime of hope, Martha stood once more in the lantern room. The great lens had been restored, not because ships required it as they once had, but because the town wished to see its old light shine again. As dusk settled across the Atlantic, the restored beacon swept slowly across the darkening water. Its first bright circle reached the harbor, then the cliffs, then the distant sea. Far below, people gathered quietly to watch. Some removed their hats. Others simply smiled. No speeches marked the moment. No ribbon was cut. The light itself said everything that needed saying. Martha rested one hand upon the polished wooden rail where she had first noticed the tiny compass rose. She smiled toward the concealed doorway behind the stone. Thomas Mercer had been right. The lighthouse had remembered. And because one patient woman had taken the time to look where everyone else hurried past, an entire town had remembered with it. Sometimes the greatest treasure hidden behind an old wall is not what waits inside. It is the better future waiting for those willing to uncover the truth with honesty, humility, and care. Years later, visitors would ask why the restored lighthouse seemed to mean so much to the people of Gray Haven. The townsfolk rarely answered by speaking about hidden chambers or forgotten ledgers. Instead, they simply pointed toward the harbor and repeated the old promise that had finally found its way home. No family in Gray Haven stands alone. And for the first time in many generations, those words were true again. Years passed, and the story of Martha Ellison slowly became the kind of tale people stopped thinking of as history and began thinking of as inheritance. Children who had never known the dark, abandoned tower grew up believing the lighthouse had always stood proudly above Black Gull Point, with its lantern shining over the Atlantic. They knew nothing of broken windows or collapsing roofs until their parents brought them to the old photographs displayed inside the restored keeper's cottage. There, beside the entrance, hung a single weathered brass key beneath a small wooden plaque. No treasure chest was displayed. No stacks of old ledgers filled the room. The hidden chamber remained exactly where it had always been, protected not because its contents belonged to one person, but because they belonged to every generation yet to come. Visitors often expected the story to end with riches. Instead, they discovered something far more enduring. The greatest wealth Martha uncovered had never rested inside the sea chest. It rested inside the forgotten promise that neighbors could become stronger than hardship when they chose to carry one another through it. The people who had once laughed when she spent her last $20 on a crumbling lighthouse no longer remembered the laughter with pride. They remembered it with humility. Whenever newcomers asked why the town cared so deeply for an old stone tower that modern ships scarcely needed anymore, someone inevitably smiled and answered the same way. Because we nearly forgot who we were. No one repeated the story to embarrass those who had doubted Martha. They repeated it to remind themselves how easily appearances deceive even good people. An abandoned building had become the heart of a community once again. A forgotten room had preserved the conscience of an entire town. And one quiet woman, who possessed almost nothing the day she climbed the hill to Black Gull Point, had restored something money could never purchase. Sometimes schoolchildren climbed the spiral staircase with their teachers. Before reaching the lantern room, they always paused where the tiny compass rose had been carved into the stone. The brass mechanism remained carefully preserved behind protective glass, and every child asked the same question. Who found it? Their teacher would always smile toward the sea before answering. A woman who spent her whole life noticing what everyone else walked past. Then they would continue climbing toward the light. Whenever Martha herself stood at the top of the tower during calm evenings, she would watch fishing boats returning safely through the harbor, their lanterns reflecting upon gentle waves much as they had when she was a little girl holding her father's hand along the shoreline. She often thought about Elias Ellison telling her that broken things deserved one more careful look before being thrown away. He had been speaking about old boats. Yet the lesson proved true for buildings, for communities, for memories, and even for people. The cottage she had lost could never be returned exactly as it once was. Samuel's gentle laugh would never echo across the workshop again. Time never grants us those gifts. Instead, it sometimes offers something quieter. The chance to transform sorrow into shelter for someone else. That became Martha Ellison's true legacy. Not that she discovered a hidden chamber, but that when she did, she chose restoration over revenge, truth over bitterness, and service over comfort. The lighthouse still stands above Black Gull Point, watching faithfully over Grey Haven just as it always has. Its brightest light has never been the lantern turning above the sea. Its brightest light has always been the reminder that hope often waits inside the very places the world has already given up on. And perhaps that is why the people of Grey Haven still speak Martha's name with quiet gratitude whenever evening settles across the harbor. Because every time the light sweeps across the water, it reminds them that forgotten things are not always finished. Sometimes they are simply waiting for the right hands to remember them. Thank you for spending this time with us and for walking beside Martha through every hardship, every mystery, and every quiet victory. If this story meant something to you, we hope you'll share it with someone who could use a reminder that hope is often hidden where few people think to look. Before you go, tell us this. What is a time in your own life when you discovered unexpected value in something or someone that others had written off? Until next time, stay close. And may you never overlook the quiet treasures waiting just beyond the places everyone else has stopped searching.